Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Pewaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. Some economists are forecasting a recession, higher inflation, and rising unemployment in the U.S. Tariffs combined with increasing hostility towards immigrant workers could be especially damaging to local economies that rely on farming, like here in Wisconsin. A new report explores what the economy has really looked like for workers in the state and what the future could hold. The State of Working Wisconsin report is compiled by the High Road Strategy Center at UW-Madison. Laura Dresser is the Associate Director of the Center, and she joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to explore their findings.
Now, this report is, of course, about the state of jobs in Wisconsin, so I was surprised to see that federal policies made a big appearance. What are some of the things that are happening at the national level right now that are having a big impact on jobs here in the state?
The things that I'm really paying attention to, we've all seen the slowing down in the labor market. This is true at the national level, especially concerning their actually lost jobs on the revisions in June. Very weak growth all across 2025. This is true in Wisconsin as well. So it looks like the economy is cooling off, and that's really concerning because of the way that the strong economy really helped workers bargain for better wages and working conditions. And we see this cooling, I think, because of the uncertainty in the policy framework at the federal level, the kind of chaotic tariff regime that continues to shift and change in ways that make it really hard for domestic and international businesses to plan. Also, the deeply anti-immigrant policy, which is keeping workers from engaging and is kind of choking off the labor force. All of this is slowing down the economy. So that's a kind of first level of federal policy. Right now, you can just barely see it in the data, but I worry about what's to come.
Yeah, that instability in certain aspects especially seem to potentially have a big impact here in Wisconsin. We'll get to the impact of immigrant workers who do make up a high percentage of our workforce here in the state. But I do want to talk about something you mentioned in there. Of course, much like the rest of the nation, job growth here has been a bit weak, but we're actually lagging a bit behind the rest of the nation. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. The period of recovery that began after the pandemic shutdowns has been a relatively strong period of growth. It's completely unlike the recovery from the Great Recession in 2008, which was very slow and grinding. This one was much more dynamic, but at the national level, much, much more dynamic than in Wisconsin. So today, at the national level, we have 5% more jobs than we did before the pandemic shutdown. In the state, we have just 2% more jobs. So the growth rate for Wisconsin has been low, and then it has slowed down in 2025. So we don't have that same dynamism that the national level has.
What are some of the potential reasons for that? Is that just the kinds of industries that we have here in the state? Is it anything to do with our state policies?
I can't say for certain. I look across the border. Minnesota has had stronger economic growth across this recovery than Wisconsin has. Minnesota also has a higher minimum wage, more investment in its public sector, and I think a kind of different model for economic development than Wisconsin has had. And so there's some hints there about what might make for a stronger economy. I think sometimes the kind of divestment or the lowering taxes and reducing the infrastructure, which is the approach that we had through the Walker years and coming out of the legislature, I think just really inhibits our ability to grow. Additionally, Wisconsin's a relatively old state, and we have more people leaving the labor market than coming into it. So that just makes this labor market tight. And I think that also makes it hard to grow.
Sure. So some of the conservative business, quote-unquote business-friendly, I suppose, policies that have been lauded by a lot of our politicians may be contributing. I'm wondering also, something that you talk about in this report is that we've seen this kind of ongoing trend of, I don't know if deunionization is quite the right word, but the collapse of union jobs in the state, despite rising support for unions, I think both nationally and locally. It is a little confusing to see these kinds of statistics, in part because you go, well, if more people are supporting unions, you'd think that they'd be joining unions. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. There are two pieces of state policy that shifted dramatically. One, obviously, Act 10 moving or changing the terms of public sector unionization in 2011. And then a few years after, the passage of what is called right to work, which is a state level policy that makes it very hard to unionize the private sector. Wisconsin goes from a level of unionization in 2010 of 14%, just barely above the national level, but still showing the roots of a kind of union-friendly state, collapses down in half to 7%. Federally, the unionization rate goes from 13 to 11%. So drifting down, not collapsing. And this is true also if you compare us to other states near our borders. Wisconsin collapse is unique. These two pieces of infrastructure, Act 10, which makes public sector unionization so hard, and what is called right to work, or the anti-union private sector unionization bill, those two make it really hard to unionize. And I think this is an observation at the national level. There's a lot of interest in unions, but the process of getting from interest to a union through an election and clear to the contract is a lot of work. And especially when we see the National Labor Relations Board tipping towards employer interests with the new nominations of the Trump administration, when we see a massive union busting at the federal level, the deunionization of 1 million workers at the federal level, there's a lot of policy that tips the table against workers. So even the increasing interest of workers in unionization is just not strong enough to overcome how hard all that pushes against unionization.
Sure. Some of the policies just making it not impossible, but more difficult to unionize.
More difficult, really difficult. Exactly.
This is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers, and I'm speaking right now with Laura Dresser from the High Road Strategy Center about their recent report on the state of working Wisconsin. Now, I will say there is some good news in this report. It's not all bad news. Wages have increased, and they've even increased above inflation, which I was surprised by. What are wages looking like in the state?
So the median wage in the state is $25 an hour right now. The person in the middle of the wage distribution, and this is all workers, not just those who earn hourly wages. Salaried workers are turned into hourly wages and then, kind of put in that distribution. So putting all the workers in the state there, you pick the one in the middle, that one's earning $25 an hour. This is in 2024 and in 2024 dollars. We don't have 2025 data, and when we do, we'll see. And wages have moved very strongly across this pandemic recovery. In 2022, like you note, inflation was really strong and wages didn't keep up with inflation that year. But every other year in this pandemic recovery, wages have moved forward faster than inflation. And the rate of change has been really substantial, so that we are at this new high of $25 an hour with 2 years of growth, bringing wages up by more than $1 an hour over the last 2 years. So that's really strong news. And the other piece of it is that it's lower wage workers who have made the stronger gains relative to inflation compared to higher wage workers. So it's equalizing a little bit across this growth period. And that's great to see too, because of the deep inequalities.
Now, as you mentioned, we don't have the numbers yet for 2025. There is a bit of uncertainty in the market right now. One of the things that really struck me about this report was, of course, Wisconsin has a high percentage of immigrants in our workforce. Can you tell us a bit what that looks like?
Yeah, 7% of the Wisconsin workforce are immigrant workers, and they're in every sector of the labor force. People may think, oh, yeah, they're in agriculture. True, like 12% of our agricultural workforce are immigrants. Also, there are doctors. 16% of our doctors are immigrants. And so immigrants are broadly in this economy. They're contributing $23 billion a year. And I think the rhetoric and the raids both make work less friendly to immigrants, make the state less friendly to immigrants, put fear in people. And that keeps people away from work. That keeps people from applying for jobs. And it keeps employers from being able to hire and fill positions. And so I think that's one of the dynamics we see going on, and that at the macro level, a lot of analysts are pointing out, we are really choking off one of the sources of growth in the labor force, which has been immigrants, through these new policies. And that's playing out in slowing down economic growth.
Yeah. I will say, I think for anybody in especially rural Wisconsin, it won't necessarily be a surprise to hear that immigrants have been helping revitalize a lot of communities. If you go into a hospital in many rural parts of the state, many of the doctors, even the nurses, they will be immigrants. Aside from, the kind of human questions that it brings up, it does concern you from just the standpoint of who's going to be working in our hospitals, who's going to be making sure that communities are able to survive.
Yeah. And our hospitals, our dairies, who's going to be working in our restaurants. Immigrant workers are everywhere in this economy, producing 23 billion of goods and services every year, and to imagine that you can just wave a wand and push that all away or go back to some prior time just feels like it's not in touch with, where we are and what's coming.
As you're looking to the future, do you have an idea of what you're expecting for 2026, or is it kind of up in the air?
So I'm very concerned about the federal level policy. Like, it's sitting down to write this, as you said, I've written this for a lot of years, and the data about jobs and wages and unions, this is what I usually focus on. But this year, the level of disruption at the federal level is so intense. And to me, I just keep seeing ways that the federal policies, whatever the rhetoric, are going to be bad for workers. And so you see the deunionization, you see the moves at the National Labor Relations Board, you see the capacity for enforcement being stripped from federal agencies, the enforcements of safety and wage and hour and other laws. You see a federal budget that delivers enormous rewards to billionaires and does that almost at the cost of cutting healthcare services for folks on Medicaid. But I see that coming back into this state and creating real problems in healthcare costs. So you see this kind of massive redistribution in the federal budget, this massive walking away from enforcing labor standards or allowing workers their rights at the federal level. And you see these tariff policies and these anti-immigration policies that are going to slow the economy down. And that picture together has me very concerned about what's to come. But as you say, it's not yet written, and some of these policies feel very uncertain. So I guess I'm not sure, but I'm concerned.
Yeah. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect. I look forward to the next report. And, here's hoping.
Yeah, here's hoping that we have some good news. There's always some good news tucked in. I'll look for it next year.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Laura Dresser is the Associate Director of High Road Strategy Center at UW-Madison, which just released its State of Working Wisconsin report. Dresser spoke with Lake Effect's Joy Powers. You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.